Okay, hello YouTube. Today I want to take a look at a gambit that I really haven't looked at in about 20 years. And now normally on my channel I do a lot of serious analysis before I do a video. This time you're going to actually sort of get a chance to do the analysis with me. For one thing, when I started doing a little bit of research, and then I noticed that there were very few games played in the actual gambit portion of this line, which leaves a lot of room to kind of explore. But then also, I just want to show you kind of like my initial process of, looking at an opening for the first time after not having looked at it for 20 years. This is a gambit. It's called the Ginsberg Gambit. You can see that's the name right here. It's this move bishop c4, and the idea is to offer up this pawn on the e4 square. This is a gambit I actually came up with myself independently when I was a kid. I played this a couple of times against a very strong player by the name of Jack Yos, who was over 2,400. And of course, when I was a kid playing it, I was like, I don't know what I was rated. I think I was rated like 1,400. But I had just beaten my first master at that point. And so then Jack Yost was at the same tournament. It was at the Minnesota Open, and then he wanted to play some blitz against me because he saw me beat Roger Rudolph, and he's like, "Oh, this kid's pretty good." And people were like, "Oh no, he's a really good blitz player," because at that point I'd played blitz against other guys that were good blitz players, and they said, "Oh, he's a really good blitz player." So I played a couple of games with Bishop C4 against Jack Yost, and of course he wanted to keep playing me because I kept getting better positions than he thought I deserved, which I did. I kept getting better positions than he thought I deserved. And what's interesting is going back and looking at this 20 years later, I can't necessarily say that I was horribly wrong about what I was doing. Or more interestingly, I can't say that he was horribly wrong about how he approached it. Because, the idea behind the Ginsberg Gambit is you give them this pawn on e4, and apparently the main idea that most people are following here is they're trying this queen h5 move with sort of the idea that they can meet e6 with this bishop to b5, which is very entertaining. So, and I guess there's no positions with games found here in the database. Well, that should be the idea, because, and again, I pointed out there's not a lot of games in this. That should be the idea. If we go to the analysis here with knight takes e4, and I run the evaluation lines, you'll notice that after knight takes e4, one of the lines given anyway is this queen h5, and then e6. And then you'll notice, they had this one game in there that was bishop e6, but bishop e6 just hangs material. The idea should be something like bishop to b5, and then on anything to d7, we don't really care what it is, as long as it breaks communication with this pawn. We're going to play knight takes e6 with a super unclear position. So, for example, bishop d7, we're going to play knight takes e6. So, the whole idea is eventually we're going to simplify into a position where black just has a slightly inferior pawn structure than white. So, something like queen e7, we could just exchange. And notice after bishop d7 and then say queen d7, we don't have time, or even knight d7. So if knight d7, we don't have time to sort of play this check and take this rook because there's a discovery against our own queen. We can play the check, we just can't take the rook. We can play the check and then say king d8, but we have to bring the knight back to d5 so that we're hitting the queen. And then we would have queen e5, queen takes e5, takes, and then castles is actually good enough for a slight edge for white, but probably best is what the computer recommends, which is just ignore it and just develop, like bishop e3, knight on d to f6. I think they're giving knight c3, knight c3, knight c3, and then the point is we're castling with check. So king d7, castles queenside, king c6, and then rook he1, slight edge white. Now, what's interesting was this wasn't at all the idea that I had when I was a kid. I didn't know about this queen h5 move, but this is apparently what other Ginsberg Gambit players kind of intend against knight takes e4. Is queen h5 sort of, I guess, with the idea of playing bishop to b5 check at some point to kind of reinforce the concept of knight e6. That wasn't my idea at all. My idea was more straightforward and apparently not totally incorrect. My idea was to take here with bishop takes f7 check, and I played this against Jack a number of times, and that's why he kept wanting to play it against me, because he kept thinking I was getting way more out of this position than I deserved. And I think we were both right. I don't think he was wrong to take the pawn, looking back, and I also don't think I was wrong to play bishop f7, looking back. King takes f7, queen h5 check, and then the whole point is, let's say king g8 or g6, and it's unclear which one of these moves is actually better. But let's say king g8, we could play something like queen d5. The point is e6, and then we just grab the knight on e4. And this is a relatively balanced position. Black has the bishop pair, but in exchange for that, he has 3 pawn islands to white's 2, and he has a weaker king. These things should actually level out. Like, the bishop pair is worth quite a bit in chess. It's about a half a pawn advantage. So the fact that black has the bishop pair is a big deal. And yes, it's a big enough deal to make up for one structure weakness and one dynamic king weakness. But of course, I liked playing these positions with white, especially when I was a younger player. I was a young tactical player. I loved playing tactical positions where I had aggressive fighting chances, and this checks all of the boxes. So this was my idea. Now, what's interesting is after I played this several times, I thought to myself, well, what could black have done differently? And I thought maybe queen a5 check was the way to go. Now, what's interesting is, like, modern computer analysis doesn't seem to think queen a5 check is any better than just knight takes e4. Now, of course, back then what I was thinking was, well, if I have to play a move like, for instance, pawn to c3, for example, now knight takes e4 can be played kind of without any difficulties, because we can play knight takes e4 and there is no queen h5. That was the basic concept behind queen a5, was that it prevents queen h5. So there is no queen a5. But as you can see here, like, if you put this like on a modern engine, it thinks just play it like a gambit, just castle, and then like if they play, e6, just play rook e1 and just, gambit your little heart out. You got plenty of compensation for that pawn. You've got a wide open king. The queen isn't particularly well placed on a5. You've got tons of compensation. But even another way to play this is, instead of pawn to c3, why not play knight c3? And this was kind of the idea that I didn't see, when I was younger. Was you can play knight c3, and the whole point is, after knight takes e4, let's just develop, because this is a gambit, right? So we're just going to develop like crazy people. We're going to threaten this check. We're going to threaten everything. So they don't really have, they can't just take stuff. They don't have knight c3 because, of course, we're going to play bishop f7, king d8, and then simply bc3. And here, it's pretty clear that black does not have enough compensation for whatever's going on. White just has a pair of doubled pawns, which isn't a big deal, but this king safety issue is, somewhat permanent. So this is kind of a problem. Actually, this is an entertaining line. Knight c6, and the computer wants to play queen c6. The point being that even after queen e5 check, king f1, bc6, knight c6 still forks king and queen. So you do get out of it with check, and you might think, oh no, I don't, and then just king f1, and then bc6, knight c6 is still forking. you get it all back, and then takes, and it's just a better pawn structure. That's all it is. It's just slightly better pawn structure for white. So all those fireworks, just a better pawn structure. But so this is the idea that I didn't know about, like when I was a younger player. Queen a5, you can just meet it with queen f3, and just this is a ton of compensation. Like the knight goes back to f6, and you can just play some aggressive attacking move like bishop f4, and you've got and like e5. And you just continue to play chess like a crazy person. You just castle queenside. And that's a lot of compensation, actually. This makes me want to take this gambit back up, because there's basically no games. Like, you can't find games in the database that go into any of this stuff very deeply. It doesn't seem like anybody plays the Ginsberg Gambit. Now, of course, the one downside of the Ginsberg Gambit is that if they want to turn it back into a main line, they can. But, and I'll get into that in a second, but like here, like bishop e7, knight d5, knight d5, bishop d5, castles, bishop takes b7, and you're absolutely fine. You get it all. It's all good. Is it finding... Yeah, just everything's cool. Bishop f6, it just wants to rip. Queen takes a8. Yes, light edge white. Okay, so... The one downside of this Ginsberg Gambit is they could just decline the gambit. Like, they could play bishops, they could play like e6. And then probably best at this point is just to transpose back into a main line. You can play knight c3, and this is just a main line shenanigan. Which I guess is okay. I mean, you can see we're going to have a lot of games in this. Tons. 1,599 games, in the database or whatever. The master's database on chess.com. So quite a few games in this. There's no doubt about that. So you're transposing right back into theory. But if they accept the gambit, I kind of like I like my old idea with bishop to f7. I also like some of these ideas with queen h5 followed by bishop b5. and knight e6. And I also like knight c3 against queen a5. Queen a5, knight c3, knight takes e4, queen f3 is something really interesting. I think this is a gambit worth exploring. I think the Ginsberg Gambit is a gambit worth exploring, and it's very entertaining stuff. It's definitely worth taking up with the white pieces. It's something I'll probably end up taking up with the white pieces again at some point, just because of it's a lot more interesting than I remember it being. Even though I played it and had some success with it when I was a younger player, I never really revisited it. I just thought, oh, it's just a weird gambit that I never really revisited. But it still looks interesting. It looks like it's worth it looks like it's worth a second look. So, anyways, I hope you found this video interesting. I hope you found it helpful. Hope you learned something new about chess. Hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.